Hi, this is lesson 13 on street gangs, which I misspelled here, so I'll correct that. Anyway, we're going to be talking about Hispanic, African American, white, Asian, and some hybrid or ethnic gangs. So it's a fairly inclusive lecture PowerPoint. There isn't going to be a whole lot of activity associated with it. I just want to get this information out to you. So, to start off with, this is a link to a number of different resources. Streetgang.com is really good. It focuses a lot on LA, but it gives you insight into history and then the number of gangs in and around that area. Organized Crime in California, it's an annual report to the legislature. I couldn't find anything quite up to date, but 2010 is probably the most complete. So I use that as a link. You have the FBI National Gang Threat Analysis, same thing. It takes a while to compile these reports, so they may not be available every single year when the new year starts. So, but anyway, I couldn't find one that's been downloaded right now. I'm sure there's one out there. And then a regional source here is the San Diego Sandag report. And I've mentioned Sandag in the past. It's a independent institution in San Diego where all cities in the county report statistical data to Sandag, and they do a number of researches and stuff. They pass statistics on to Washington, and the FBI's criminal index uses that material for this area for statistic reporting and crime. So Sandag is pretty important. So I included these four different resources for you to check and look at. They're pretty complete, and I suggest you do look at them to get a little bit more insight and clarify any questions. So this is going to be an overview. So we're going to start off with your objectives. And this is going to be important. I want you to recognize the California Department of Justice definition for what is a street gang. And then I want you to be able to recognize the USC, the U.S. Code, Title 18521, which defines a gang member and a street gang. It's used for sentencing enhancements. So if there's a member that can be proven that they're a gang member and they committed a major crime from a federal statute, then that section's used to give them additional time in prison. I want you to recognize the California STEP Act. I want you to be able to list 8 elements of the STEP Act. I want you to recognize 8 criminal acts listed in the STEP Act. Recognize the Cal Gang definition of a gang. And list 4 California Department of Justice criteria for gang documentation. And list 8 criteria for documentation as a gang member in the Cal Gang system. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth here shortly. So let me just correct this here. Okay. Gangs have been an important item to research from both state and national standpoint as far as getting a handle on individual crime. The gang problem here in the United States just exploded back in the early 1980s up through the 90s. There's a number of reasons, we'll get into that, but it was a focus for study, if you will, for most of your statistical institutions, also major crime agencies like the FBI, Department of Justice, both state and federal. So the gang issue is very, very important here as far as our law enforcement as far as law enforcement goes. So, uh, in a number of different reports, you'll see that street gangs, there's a general consensus that street gangs are terrorizing communities throughout the nation. Uh, they have morphed into a more sophisticated organized criminal element. Before they were loosely jointed, they were all independent. They were just nothing but a little bunch of street thugs. But right now, we're finding a lot of the Hispanic, particularly Hispanic and Asian, and well, even white gangs are linking up and joining an association with your prison gangs. So prison gangs are utilizing street gangs to conduct a lot of their activities outside prison walls. As a result, individual residents living in around these areas that gang members either frequent or claim as territory, their individual freedoms are denied. Their quality of life is certainly impacted by these gang members. Like I mentioned earlier, street gangs are more organized. They're more sophisticated with modern technology, with social media, with cell phones. They're able to conduct business in a much more clandestine way than they used to. They're increasing in size. They're not getting any smaller. Even you may see some statistical studies saying they're not growing. Maybe they're not growing in numbers, but they're moving into other areas that they would not frequent in the past. Street gangs were a phenomena of the urban living environment, but now we're finding that they're moving into your suburban areas, your rural areas. They're beginning to infiltrate areas that they never used to exist. Your membership's lasting a lot longer, basically due to the association with prison gangs. You're finding when these people get arrested, they're joining prison gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Western Familia. When they get out of prison, they maintain that relationship, but they do go back to their neighborhoods and rejoin and become leaders of the street gang. So they're maintaining their affiliation much longer. They're currently involved in much more sophisticated crime. We have evidence now that they're heavily involved in human trafficking, prostitution, and computer fraud. So they've branched out. They've definitely have adapted to the use of modern technology and things that are available out there. You have migrant or ethnic gangs are increasing in size, basically due to the number of conflicts and wars that we have going on in the world, and bringing in different refugees and immigrant groups from these areas. Like we learned in early on, as far as organized crime, bringing immigrants in, they're subject to discrimination, persecution. They are banding together, and basically for safety, they're forming their own gangs in response to the predatory efforts of established street gangs in the areas that they live. According to the report, the annual report on organized crime in California, and these are 2010 numbers, but they've probably increased a little bit, but not significantly. They estimate that there's 235,565 gang members currently residing in California. There's 6,442 individual gangs. You can see Hispanic gangs make up the vast majority of these gang members. Black gangs are second. Your white gang members are about third, and then you have Asian, and then followed by Pacific Islander groups. And then you have undesignated race gang members that may take on a name or an affiliation with an established gang group, but they may be multi-ethnic and don't fit into the normal membership guidelines that you'll find in your more established street gangs. Most of your street gangs, the types of crimes that they are involved in, the number one thing is drugs. That is what gets them the vast majority of their money to be able to exist. Followed up by some violent crime of robbery, extortion, assault. You have auto theft, grand theft, witness intimidation or victim intimidation. Of course, you have computer fraud like identity theft. When things, if there's a war between rivaling gang members and gangs, you have your drive-by shootings. And like I mentioned earlier, they're definitely getting more involved in your human trafficking and prostitution. The ultimate, though, obviously is murder, which they conduct quite frequently. We're seeing a new phenomena where you have female gang members are increasing in numbers. Before, female gang members were strictly affiliated with the more established male gang groups that controlled a particular neighborhood or territory. This is still the case. Even though there are female gang members, you find that they don't last as long in a particular gang. They are a affiliate of your most established gang that controls the areas in the neighborhoods that they live in. But you have independent female gangs now that are definitely in competition to a degree with their male counterparts. They have created a little niche for themselves, and they're becoming more of a threat and a force to reckon with. Like I said earlier, California, once rock cocaine or crack cocaine made its appearance, it changed the entire complexion of the gang situation here in California, and then it created a domino effect nationwide. Here you've got a very marketable drug that has a very high potency and addiction rate. It's cocaine basically based down to its initial raw state, where the only way you can administer raw cocaine is by smoking it. It's not water soluble, so therefore it can't be injected. It can't be snorted up through the nasal passages. It strictly is a smokable element. And with the advent of crack cocaine, you found gangs were tasked by the controlling gangs or prison gangs who were in affiliation with the cartels to go out and sell the stuff. And there was a lot of money to be made because you didn't have to sell large quantities. The crack cocaine could be broken up into little $5 chunks up to several $100 weights. So it was a marketing situation that appealed to the low-level drug user on the street, where you could just scrounge up a little bit of money in order to get their crack cocaine fix. And the battles for drug turf created an unbelievable amount of violence, and particularly up in the LA area. So as a result of this violence, you had a proposition that went through back in the about the mid 1980s, and it was called the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act. The acronym for it is STEP, so the STEP Act. And as you can see here, it appeals to the general community in a neighborhood that everybody has a right to be secure and protected from fear, intimidation, and physical harm in your house and in your neighborhood. And it was recognized that gangs ended up interfering and violating that whole philosophy and mode of thought, if you will. So this proposition came through, it was voted on, and you found an amendment to the penal code which created a new law called PC 186.21. and that was the STEP Act. And basically, what that did is similar to what Title 18 with the federal government did, is set up enhancements for sentencing for people that were documented gang members that ended up committing a number of crimes, violent crimes that are listed in this STEP Act. So this was a way of fighting back to get enhanced sentencing. So part of the requirements here for PC 186.22 is that you have, number one, an association or an organization. It's got to be the gang as a whole. And it's got to consist, and this is by California standards, 3 or more persons. Now, you'll find with the STEP Act, let's go back up here to where I was. Okay. With the STEP Act, blah, blah. Now, as part of the STEP Act, you had the formation and the passage of an amendment to the California Penal Code for Section 186.22, subsection F. This is basically an enhancing section for people that have been arrested and convicted of some type of violent crime or crime, and there's a nexus between the suspect and the fact that they are a gang member. So, with the STEP Act, first of all, it wants to define what a gang is. So, according to our definition, it's any ongoing organization or association consisting of 3 or more persons. This differs slightly from the federal definition of Title 18, where they say 5 or more. Well, the feds look at it in a little bit larger scale as far as organizations and the how it affiliates with the RICO Act, etc., which has just recently been changed also. But here in California, we take the stance of any group with 3 or more people, formal or informal. What does that mean, formal or informal? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to have a hierarchy with a leader and, the typical bureaucratic pyramid that we've talked about before with traditional organized crime. It can be loosely structured. So, or it can be a very organized criminal element that has very defined roles and positions within the group. So it could be either or. And they have to be engaged in some type of antisocial behavior, criminal antisocial behavior, behaviors that affect neighborhoods and individuals and the quality of life. So, in addition to that, having one of its primary activities, the commission of 1 or more of the criminal acts enumerated in paragraphs 1 through 8. We'll talk about these different acts here shortly. It has to have a common name. Nowadays, we're beginning to see with some of these hybrid gangs, they don't have a name, so they're trying to get around that, and we have to address these issues. They have a common identifying sign or symbol, with their hand signs or something that is some artist rendition of something. If you look at the Latin Kings, they have a 5-pointed crown. That is their symbol. MA, EME, NF, Nuestra Familia. So these are all symbols of organized criminal gangs. And this is what we mean by that here. And members collectively or individually engage in or have engaged in a pattern of criminal activity. So, under the umbrella of the gangs itself, let's say, they rob a street person of some money or clothing or a cell phone or what have you. And as they're running away, they're yelling the gang name or throwing gang signs or symbols as they're fleeing the scene. Now, your criminal acts, these are what we were talking about before, the 8. Assault with a deadly weapon, robbery, murder, drugs, shooting at inhabited dwellings or an occupied motor vehicle, arson, witness and victim intimidation, and grand theft. I mean, these are what we call predicate acts that, if they are committing under the umbrella of being in a gang, then they definitely can be documented as a gang and gang members. Now, further documentation. Let's say they admit to being a gang member. As a police officer, I contact them out on the street, and you know, through the contact, I ask them, "Are you a gang member, or do you belong to such and such a gang?" You know, and if they say yeah, you know, or they admit to it, or through the course of the conversation they relate to that type of activity, well, then that meets one of our predicate criteria. Association. Well, that basically, you know, it's self-explanatory. If I contact this person and they're in association with a number of different, or a number of gang members that are associated with this gang, well, then that meets a predicate documentation criteria. So these are all things that we look for. Clothing, this is probably about the hardest one to pigeonhole somebody into being a gang member. You can't say somebody is a gang member based on the fact that they're wearing, say, a Dodger jersey or a St. Louis Cardinal baseball hat or something to that effect. It usually has to have something that has the gang name, the gang symbol on it to be considered gang clothing nowadays. In the past, you could, because it was indicative of, particularly with your African American gangs, wearing red and blue. But nowadays, it definitely has to have a type of gang name or symbol that's affiliated with that particular group. And then lastly, you've got reliable information. Well, what is that? Well, police officer from possibly another agency has contacted the individual, and you had a self-admission maybe, or some other activity that was associated with the gang. So they can definitely testify to the person's membership. Let's say a police officer was working undercover, then that's also reliable. Citizens informants, citizen that live in and around the area know these gang members because they're part of the neighborhood. They know these kids since they grew up. They see the type of activity that they've involved in. That is reliable information that we can go by. So CalGang, now this is a organization that is it's a state-funded database, if you will, and it's a criminal intelligence database. And this came about along with the STEP Act because the chiefs of police said, you know, we as police departments are operating a little too independently of one another. You know, one office has certain standards to document gang members and the storage of criminal intelligence. They have their own guidelines and regulations. So the state legislature, government, and chiefs of police got together and they said, okay, we need a central depository with centralized and standardized regulations. So they created this entity called CalGangs. And every region has got an agency that's in charge of the collection and dissemination of data that relates to gangs. So what it is, it's designed to collect, store, and disseminate information on criminal street gangs. The system targets members and associates of criminal street gangs, but it also operates pursuant to the United States Code of Federal Regulations, Title 28, Part 23, as a criminal intelligence system. there's some very heavy guidelines the feds have put down as far as keeping intelligence files on American citizens. We normally don't do that, but if you have reached this and met this criteria, then you're subject to have a criminal intelligence file on you. Now, there's stipulations for washout, eliminating you from this file. So there's a lot of guidelines in place, but gang members are that are contacted, that are arrested, all their information is put in this data bank so that any police officer who meets the criteria to get into it, and you have to go to a class, learn how to use it, become certified in it. And there's a lot of, like I say, regulations in order to get to the information. But once you do, it's very handy to find out who is involved in gangs and who their associates are, what type of cars they drive, what type of tattoos they have, where they live, so on and so on. So it's a pretty valuable database, but it is under very strict and tight controls. Now, the California gang documentation criteria. So this comes through the Department of Justice. And for a group to be documented as a gang, they have to meet 4 criteria. And that it has a name or some type of identifiable leadership or moniker, if you will. There has to be a designated territory or some geographic area that causes or contributes to the deterioration of community through a pattern of criminal activity. The group associates on a regular basis, and the group is involved in a pattern of criminal activity, at least 2 or more felonious acts that we enumerated in PC 186. Now, in this county, we've taken it a little step further as far as being a little bit more conservative as far as our documentation criteria as a gang member. And in order to be documented and have your information put into CalGangs, you should have 3 separate contacts, meaning 1 or more of the criteria, or 1 contact with 3 criteria. So in other words, you have 3 separate contacts with, say, any one of these criteria, or you have 1 that meets any of these criteria. So anyway, this should be number 4 here, I think. There we go. Okay, so that San Diego is a little bit more conservative. Now, National City is the only city that requires 2 instead of 3. Two separate contacts, meaning 1 or more of the criteria. So they've got a gang problem down there, and so they've kind of gone against the grain a little bit here. So for gang criteria, for your predicate acts, again, is admitted to being a gang member, has been arrested alone or with known gang members, has been identified as a gang member by a tested informant, and has been seen affiliating. So that's the CalGang criteria. Ours is a little bit more. It's a little bit different. You have to have these 3 separate contacts for this type of stuff. And then CalGangs has got its criteria. Ours comes under this, but we've taken a little bit more conservative approach to it. You also have displaying hand signed signals. Subjects have been seen frequenting gang members, wearing gang dress attire, and again, I said that's slightly ambiguous. And subject is known to have gang tattoos. Now, one thing that can supersede that criteria is, let's say the person's been arrested for a crime. They're in jail, and prior to them going and being assigned to a housing unit, they end up go through what you call a pre-classification or a classification interview before they go to housing. This is for their protection. If there's any indication that they are gang members or they're going to have a problem once they get into this custodial situation with other gang members, jail staff conducts a interview to see what is the most applicable housing unit to put them in. So during this custodial classification, I mean, obviously there's gangs that are rivals that are at war with one another. And, a lot of these gang members don't want to go to particular jail cells. So they will admit to being a gang member, and that in itself will supersede the documentation criteria because that comes under a self-admission. So. Now, this title here, this is a link. This explains Title 18521. This is the federal code for documentation and as a gang member. It is used as a post-sentencing enhancement. So once again, if somebody has been arrested and convicted by the feds, they're shown to be a gang member, then Title 18 can kick in and give them additional time. Okay, we're going to talk about different street gangs. We're going to start off with Hispanic, go to African American and Asian, white, and then prison. Also down here, I'm going to add another one here if you don't mind. It's going to be more of your ethnic migrant. And this is more ethnic and cultural. And I'll explain what this is in a minute. So this is the behaviors, if you will, of different street gangs within nationally, and just the type of activity that they associate themselves with. Let me. Okay. Yeah. The Hispanic all the way down, most of them are all involved in some type of ethnic activity. I mean, ethnic and cultural. Hispanic, obviously, most Hispanic gangs rely on ethnicity to be in. I mean, there's every once in a while they'll let maybe a white guy in. And on one occasion, there was a local gang here that actually had an African American in it. Normally, you don't find it. Asian, white, they can commingle, but they're ethnic, they're cultural. The ethnic migrant types, as a result of the different refugee groups that are coming into this country as a result of the different worldwide conflicts, they're subject to the same type of discrimination and persecution that most ethnic groups encounter when they come here, causing them to form gangs for protection. This is definitely heavily ethnic and cultural. Prison gangs are ethnic. Your Hispanic, African American gangs are more territorial than Asian, white, the ethnic or the prison gangs. Okay, so Hispanic gangs. We know they began forming in the 1920s, particularly in some of your larger areas, but let's talk about Southern California and LA. I mean, that's where we found these groups beginning to form. Were in the areas surrounding central LA, up in the Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights area of Los Angeles. And most of the Mexican immigrants at this time were employed for labor, lower production style jobs, and consequently, like I say, a lot of new arrivals from another country, as we've seen, have been subject to discrimination and polarization, if you will. Your members in Hispanic gangs usually are recruited at about 14 years old up to about 20. Early on, they were engaged in property crimes and burglary, then robbery, vandalism, drugs, extortion. Nowadays, you have victim witness intimidation. We call it net banging, where you're actually on the computer, which new technology is taking over here. So your social media like Facebook, MySpace, what have you, that's where they're doing a lot of their boasting, a lot of their proclamations, challenges, or what have you. So that's becoming big now through your social media. And they've also branched out to include human trafficking and prostitution now. In the early years, there wasn't much structure or leadership. Usually it was just a bunch of youth that lived in a particular area or neighborhood banding together and protecting the neighborhood from outside groups coming in. They were primarily defensive, so they became very territorial of a very defined area. Most of the disputes that occurred were, around personal interactions, violation of territory. As gangs, and not all gangs, but Hispanic gangs were no different. You had to participate or involve yourself in a major, crime in order to gain gang acceptance and membership. Finally, getting sentenced to prison, that was a big thing. Incarceration earned you a lot of status within the community. So we found, though, by the 1980s, gang violence was increasing exponentially. Gangs were branching out. They were targeting gangs outside the community in the city. You started having drive-by shootings. You had assaults, murders. Gangs were becoming more sophisticated. They're developing a more inclusive structure and organization. The Hispanics, your street gangs, found that Nuestra Familia up in Northern California, MA in Southern California, started affiliating themselves with their old gangs where they grew up and started using them to commit or carry through different types of crimes or directives that were coming from prison walls, and having the individual neighborhood gang members commit these on behalf of the prison gang. So, and that was also kind of a entryway so that once these kids ended up getting arrested and actually doing some major time, that they would be protected by the MA and NF groups, and even Central California, the Fresno Bulldogs. So these prison groups basically started controlling the neighborhood gangs. And once your prison gang members started getting out of prison and going back into the neighborhoods, they started taking over the gangs to work in concert with the prison gangs. So you had older, more experienced leadership getting involved with the Hispanic or neighborhood gang. So once these older gang members get out, they call them veteranos, or OGs, your old gang members. They begin to mentor, they begin to train these younger gang members, and we find that recruitment is starting as young as 12 years old. The average age is probably about late teens, but new members can be accepted up to 25 years old. They're territorial or turf oriented. They've added more crime to their standard operating procedures. We find that female gangs are growing in membership or accepted by the Hispanic group. They work in concert with one another, the male gang obviously being dominant. But before, females were basically used nothing more than as mules to carry drugs, transport drugs, carry weapons, because of the gang members. If they were caught by police and had weapons on them, obviously they would go to jail. So the females started carrying weapons, and now they've branched off. They're actually have their own gangs, but they're in affiliation with the main Hispanic gang, but or fight other female gang members that are associated with a rival gang. But Hispanics, kind of led the way. They have very unique trademarks: their tattoos, hand signs, monikers, graffiti. Has been set up and established by your Hispanic gang members, and it's been copied by other street gangs. We estimated over 235,000 gang members total, but there's over 150,000. Let me just bear with me here. It's over 150,000 Hispanic. So let's just clarify that. I don't get you confused. And then there's over 150,000 Hispanics. So, I mean, by far, Hispanic gang members outnumber the other gangs. Hold on, I got a phone call coming in. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had a phone call I had to take. Anyway. Going back, DOJ estimated that there's over 235,000 gang members in California, but there's more than 150,000 that are Hispanic. So Hispanic gang members far outnumber, the rest of street gang members in California. We're finding they're in their second, third, and even fourth generation now. So it's, talk about the self-perpetual attributes. I mean, this is pretty indicative of the Hispanic gang culture. Kids are getting younger when they're being recruited. They're recruited as juveniles. Committing felonies to gain acceptance is important. Loyalty is the utmost regulation, if you will. And they develop the hand signs, a lot of your graffiti that you see nowadays that are copied. But going back to the early days, the Hispanic males grouped together for neighborhood or barrio social affairs. The groups bonded for personal and neighborhood protection, and before long they're engaged in criminal activities like burglary, strong arm robbery, vandalism, and they used weapons such as knives, chains, clubs, rocks, bottles, and zip guns. In 1942, the 38th Street gang members were charged in LA with the murder of a Mexican national. This case, the criminal charges effectively united the Mexican-American community. You got to remember the Mexican-American community was really discriminated against, and some heavy-handed policies by LAPD at the time. You got to remember, it's 1942. The war has just started, and a lot of the migrants, because they're not American citizens, aren't fighting for the U.S., and consequently, there's a huge vacuum of white males that are off fighting the war, and having so many free and unencumbered males not at war didn't sit too well with local authorities as well as servicemen themselves. And that'll lead into another situation that happened. Because in 1943, you had a lot of tension between the U.S. servicemen and what they described as zoot suiters. And a zoot suitor basically looked like this. They were Hispanic males that would dress in real baggy suits, oversized jackets, looking kind of sharp, but nevertheless was against the normal fashion trend at the time. And it was just very cultural that these guys were dressed up like that. So American servicemen that were fighting and dying overseas when they were on liberty, particularly in the LA area, they would come in contact with these guys who were not fighting the war. They were working jobs, but nevertheless, they weren't putting their lives on the line, and that didn't sit too well. So a big riot broke out between the American servicemen and Zoot Suiters in 1943. They called themselves the Pachucos, and again, it was kind of indicative of gang-style dress for the day, and it was in East Los Angeles, and they called it the Zoot Suit Riots, and it was basically a riot that lasted 3 days with more than 500 Mexican-American youths charged with rioting and vagrancy. Los Angeles city officials cited youth gangs as the reason behind the violence. This too had an unintended consequence for fortifying the bonds of young Latinos and with the Mexican American community. So there was a lot of dissension, and that was one of the main things that caused a polarization, if you will. Nowadays, the types of crime that most Hispanic gangs are involved in is robbery, burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, your drive-by shootings. Drug sales is the number one thing to keep gangs afloat. They're been active with the Mexican mafia, and then selling and manufacturing PCP, which used to be really big in the 80s, maybe not so much anymore, but it does make a comeback every once in a while. It's basically a tranquilizer. Heroin, meth, marijuana, human trafficking for prostitution purposes, your computer crime, arms trafficking. We also have found, that gangs, the arsenals have expanded. You have large caliber handguns, you've got shotguns, automatic weapons. So things have changed since the 1920s. Hispanic gangs defend their turf and their reputations with a vengeance. Law enforcement has been an increased target for Hispanic street gangs like your MS-13. They work in concert with your Hispanic prison gangs, Norteño, Sureño, MA, and Nuestra Familia. I can also put down here the Fresno Bulldogs that have the Central Valley. So these are all three. These are the most powerful Hispanic groups here in California. Okay, your African American gangs started off very informally. They were pretty loose in their organization, meaning there was no real formal structure to it. They weren't very territorial. They're very unorganized. Unlike their Hispanic counterparts, there wasn't much graffiti associated with them at the time. And they would assume other gang type identities. They were trying to fit in, but nevertheless, they started copying what particularly the Hispanic gangs were doing. The gang membership consisted of mostly family and neighborhood friends. They personified the so-called tough guy image, which was popular back in the 1950s. South LA and the Compton area was the early breeding ground for what would become the Crip gang. But these were formed basically as for protection against particularly your Hispanic gangs that were kind of predatory on the black youth. So they started off very similar to, like most ethnic gangs in the neighborhoods. But then it wasn't until the 1960s that things changed, particularly with drugs and also the Black Panther and so-called social revolution movement, if you will, in in the United States. And started with this individual by the name of Raymond Washington and the Crips. Okay, and right here you've got Crip gang members, and over here is Raymond Washington, and he basically founded the Crips. But he was a young man. He was about 15 at the time, back in about the mid to late 60s. He wanted to get into the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. And he was too young, so he couldn't get in it. And by this time, the Black Panthers were changing complexion. They were turning more into a, communist, neo-Marxist movement, and they were under a lot of pressure from the federal government and local agencies. So that movement was pretty much waning by the time Washington was, old enough to get involved in something like that. Now, during this time, you had a number of African American gangs that were pretty well established. You had the farmers, the Slossons, the Huns, the businessmen, the Surveillance, the Gladiators, and the Avenue Boys. I mean, these were all fairly territorial groups that were in South Central LA and the Compton area. Raymond Washington, like I said, he was in the kind of the West LA, but more in the South Central down towards Compton. And he started a group that wasn't called the Crips initially. And therein lies a question, how did the name Crip come about? And there's a whole bunch, there's a number of different explanations, and I don't know if there's really any one explanation. So when Raymond Washington started his group, he called it the Community Revolution in Progress, so CRIP, Crip. And the gang he actually started, though, because he was kind of doing it on political lines, but these guys are very apolitical. And there was a very popular, established African American group called the Avenue Boys. And because Raymond Washington and his group were younger, they called themselves the Baby Avenue Boys. So, as we will get going here, we'll delve in it a little bit more. There was also a popular TV show called Tales of the Crip, but I don't think that really had anything to do with it. That was just one explanation, but I think that's probably about the least probable. Accordingly, Raymond Washington was lame in one leg, so he was a cripple, and he had a nickname of Crip, so Crip became short for cripple. Also, the group, the Baby Avenue Boys, they walked around with canes for protection, and so they called them, just Crip because they had canes. And also, the Avenue Boys, the older gang that Washington was trying to emulate, they used to associate, and they had a territory in and around an area called Crib Avenue, and people think that it just may have morphed into Crip and not Crib. So I don't know. There's a number of different explanations. Not that important, but just to give you a little historical background. They were an offshoot of the Slossons and the Avenue Boys, so that was just, part of what the Slossons called themselves, the Cribs, because they did associate on Crib Avenue. So that's kind of the feeling. But Raymond Washington initially went to Washington High School in L.A., and they had the color blue. And apparently, just to identify themselves, they started wearing blue clothing, which was part of the school colors. I can't say he was, that into high school and that dedicated to Washington High. But nevertheless, he was kicked out and expelled at a number of high schools. But that was really one of the first ones he went to. Early on, they were involved in extortion, assault, robbery. And what happened is, just with the way he was running things, he started incorporating a number of surrounding gangs into his group. Now, his group wasn't one big super gang. It was made up of what they called sets. And the sets occupied different neighborhoods in and around South Central LA. So they're all independent of one another, but nevertheless, from a collective standpoint, they claim themselves to be Crips. If you look at LA, Main Street is the dividing line through Los Angeles. Main Street goes on for about 10 or 15 miles. It's a very rather long street. It terminates down in the San Pedro area, and it goes clear up north to the Lincoln Park area, past central LA. So it's quite lengthy, and obviously there's a number of neighborhoods, both on the east and the west side of it. So Main Street is the dividing line for the Crip sets that live in and around central LA. Actually, those sets that are on the west side of Main Street are called West Side Crips. And then on the east side, they're called East Coast Crips. Has nothing to do with, living in New York or New Jersey or anything. Main Street is dividing line. So those Crip sets that are to the west are West Side. And those to the east are called East Coast. Remember, the sets are independent from one another. They will feud when provoked. They will have drive-bys on each other. The hated rival, obviously, is the Blood set, or the Blood Street Gang, and they're different sets. But that's probably the biggest time that you'll find Crip gangs coming together to fight the Bloods. And it's usually, all these battles usually come down to a control over turf for drug money. So, Crip gang colors are blue. They'll have a blue rag, a handkerchief, blue sports clothing, like the Dodgers, Kansas City Royals, Duke University, North Carolina. Or neutral colors, blacks, browns, so that they don't stick out. But here I put, a number of different, it's usually kind of a brighter blue that they'll wear. But they'll wear dark blue, navy, what have you. But, you have the LA sport cap, so that's typical. But that's their gang colors. They'll wear blue shoelaces. They won't wear anything with red on it. Bloods, on the other hand, just like the name sounds, they wear blood. Or they wear red, I'm sorry. The Bloods were developed in response to the Crip gang and their harassment. They basically came out of the Compton area. They banded together from protection. Their Crips and Bloods are traditional rivals. They do not get along. Bloods were developed by Sylvester Scott and Vincent Owens. They were the founders. And they were members of the Piru gang out of East Compton. Piru is a street. San Diego has a street called Piru Street. So you'll find Bloods will call themselves Pirus, kind of as an affiliation with the early founding of it, or if they actually lived there. But they were known as blood gangs because they're like blood brothers. They had to adapt. They're inferior in numbers. The Crips far outnumber them, but the Crips are less united, whereas Bloods are pretty united because they have to be, because they have less numbers. They're also more violent. But like I said, they originated on West Piru Street in Compton. But there's different groups that set out to be Bloods, and that were the Brims, the Bounty Hunters, the Swans, the Pirus. They're violent, they're ruthless due to the numerical difference between them and the Crips. They got their start, Scott and Owens, they were both members of Centennial High, so the color of that school was red. You'll also find that Bloods will wear purple. They will wear green, too. So they can predominantly wear the red, but purple and green are also authorized colors. So they'll have sports clothing, either red, green, purple. You have the St. Louis Cardinals, Kansas City Chiefs, etc. So or they'll have neutral clothing with some type of red trim. Like most of your gangs, they're involved in burglary, robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, drug possession, sales, marijuana, PCP, or LSD. Uh, with the advent of rock cocaine in 1983, you had a national exodus from these urban areas in South Central to other parts of the country. And basically, what happened is these different gangs saw a marketing opportunity to sell the drugs. And either, number one, they were wanted by other gang members, so they were fleeing for their safety, or they were wanted by police, they were fleeing from them, or they went out and they joined other family members or relatives in these other areas throughout the country and started living with them and taking shipments of crack or rock cocaine to these areas. So the violent quotient increased 100-fold for a share of the crack market, and that's where a lot of the violence was associated with. Today, we're finding a lot of your street gang members are involved in the human trafficking and prostitution side, your computer fraud and ID theft. So they're branching out technology. Okay, by the 1980s, we found that the Crips and the Bloods were becoming much more organized. I mean, they definitely graduated into what we would consider more of an organized crime group. You found that they were liaisoning with international drug dealers like the Colombians, the Mexicans, in order to obtain cocaine and methamphetamine and some of your other drugs, marijuana, if you will, where they would deal directly with them and sell the product in the areas, the cities that were controlled by these street gangs. They're also involved in high-end jewelry thefts and not so much computer crime at this time, but where you found where these guys really gained their notoriety, if you will, was during the LA street riots after Rodney King in 1992. And the LA street riots started down on Normandy Boulevard, down South Central LA towards Compton area. And you found the Blood gang members were heavily involved in initiating that whole thing, and then complete with the looting and everything else of the stores. But they gained a lot of influence and strength, if you will, during the 80s with their cocaine dealing. You have Asian street gangs. We found, like we do anywhere else, we had a number of different Vietnamese immigrating over here during the mid and post-Vietnam War. You had Laotian, Cambodia, Viet Chinh, which are Chinese that are ethnic Chinese living in Vietnam. They came over in mass. They were refugees that we had to get out of Vietnam when we pulled out of there. And then to protect themselves from other gang members and ethnic groups, they created their own gangs. And somewhat of a copycat, but they're different. They're loose-knit. There's not much loyalty among groups. I mean, they'll even take on names of Crips and Bloods and so on and so forth, but they operate a lot differently than your Hispanic and African-American gangs. They're a little bit more involved in white-collar style crime. They are violent, but by 1985, they came over in the 70s, and by 85, they became more organized. So they were really big into vehicle theft. That was one of their big things. Extortion among members of their own community, firearms violation, home invasion robbery was big because they found that ethnic Vietnamese and Asians came from corrupt countries wouldn't trust government, so they wouldn't put money in banks, so they kept it at home. So these gang members that knew business owners, knew where they lived, they basically knew that they would have large sums of cash in the house. So you had a lot of home invasion robberies, witness intimidation, victim intimidation, assaults, murder. They ran a lot of your massage parlors and prostitution type things in concert with Asian organized crime. They were big in computer chip theft back in the 80s. And they also had a big operation going with vehicle accident and insurance fraud. So you can see they're a little bit different, a little bit more sophisticated with the type of crime that they were involved in as opposed to your Hispanic and African American gangs. They're pretty vicious, very ruthless, very violent. They will also go outside their neighborhoods to commit different crimes in other Asian neighborhoods. So, unlike at the time a lot of your Hispanic and African American gangs, most of your Asian groups are Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese. But a couple names: you had the Street Killer Boys, Tiny Rascal Gangsters, Black Dragons, and the Natoma Boys. These are pretty much up in the LA area here. Asian gangs will adopt names that relate to their cultural and to their ethnic ancestry. So, case in point, you'll have tiny Oriental Crips, your Cambodian Crips, Asian West Side. Also, another thing that really separates them from the other groups is that the females are widely accepted way before any of these other groups would accept females into their gangs. So female Asian are widely accepted as regular gang members. You'd have Wally girls, Pomona girls, dirty punks. So the Asians set the tone for allowing women to come in. They were better organized. They had very strong affiliation before the other groups did. You had the Chinese organized crime called Hua Qing. You had Wu Up Tu over in China. Hua Qing, I believe, was over up in San Francisco, but it was still an international group. And then also the Yakuza out of Japan. Your motorcycle or your white gangs, they're a lot different. Not so much territorial neighborhood like the other African American and Hispanic. Most of your white street gangs come out of motorcycle gangs. Then back in the 80s, you had your skinheads, which were more racist than anything. You had other white supremacy or racist groups that formed. You have your white extremists, your militias that are their ideology revolves around religion or politics in a way. These really aren't street gangs, but nevertheless, you still have areas that are controlled by these different groups. There's direct affiliation with the Aryan Brotherhood, the Nazi lowriders, the Peckerwoods, who are prison gangs, AB controlling all of those. Your white gangs can consist of both male and female. And obviously there's graffiti, monikers, there's tattoos. But for the most part, you find a racist or more neo-fascist influence. They're not territorial other than your outlaw motorcycle gangs that will claim a turf. Your white street gangs, they're big in the manufacturing of, like, say, methamphetamine and some of your pharmaceuticals, vehicle theft, operate prostitution, massage parlors, and streetwalkers. Extortion, you have tagger groups. You also have groups involved in identity theft and witness intimidation. And they also do mercenary work for other gangs where they can be hired out. You've got another thing now with ethnic base. You've got a large percentage of East African or Somali immigrants living here in the United States. There's a huge contingent in San Diego. Sudanese, the same thing. More towards the East Coast and Midwest, you've got Caribbean consisting of Dominican, Haitian, and Jamaican. I guess that's spelled wrong. With Jamaican gang members. So these ethnic base, you see that common denominator throughout this whole thing with new immigrant groups kind of banding together for protection due to discrimination and polarization for safety, and then ultimately for survival for economic means. So, what's the key here? I'm not quite sure. I mean, this has been going on for a long, long time. And lastly, you've got your hybrid or your jugalos. Uh, this group this group started off just a name of dedicated fans to some rock group called the Insane Clown Posse or any other psychopathic record artist. It's a subculture that originated from ad hoc fans, uh, from horrorcore hip hop music, if you will. Criminal groups began using the name Juggalo, I guess, and associated imagery of mainstream Juggalo culture. They've been classified as a criminal street gang by the government and law enforcement agencies, operating at Arizona, California, Pennsylvania, and Utah. Uh, Juggalo gang sets have been documented in at least 21 states. Uh, they band together on the Juggalo banner in order to engage in a pattern of criminal activity. The gangs have handbooks detailing gang ranks and responsibilities and commit crimes for financial gain. Uh, According to the National Gang Intelligence Center, 85 to 90% of self-described gigolos are peaceful, non-criminal, violent, or non-criminal music fans. The other 10 to 15% make up a juggalo subculture criminal element, which has been linked to extortion, murder, domestic terrorism, drive-by shootings, drug trafficking, arson, burglary, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and weapons offenses. So, uh, I mean, it comes under the full definition of a gang. You have both male and female members involved in this. So, it's a new phenomena. I know it came out a few years ago. I'm not quite sure what uh, how prevalent they are, but nevertheless, I mean, it is a criminal organized group, and it is changing the complexion of street gangs. We're finding street gangs overall are becoming a little bit more united, uh, where before they used to hate each other and be at war with one another. We're finding they're coming into some common ground, common territory, in order to share profits and different criminal enterprises without interference. So, complexion is changing with technology. Uh, we'll see what happens now with some of the new laws that are going to be enacted with some of these propositions. So, street gang operation has changed considerably since the 60s, 70s on up. And it's going to be a factor that is going to continue to impact and influence the community.